Imagine a world just waking up from the longest nightmare it had ever known. The year is 1920, and the Great War has finally ended, leaving behind millions of graves scattered across the fields of Europe and a strange, restless energy humming through the streets of America. The factories that had been building bombs and rifles and tanks were still running, their furnaces still glowing, their assembly lines still turning. But now there was nothing to destroy, and so they began to create. They created toasters and radios and automobiles and washing machines and canned foods and cigarettes and perfumes, and 1,000 other things that poured out of smokestacks and loading docks and into a country that had never seen so much abundance in all its history. But here was the problem, the quiet problem that no one talked about in polite company, the problem that kept the factory owners awake at night staring at their bedroom ceilings. People did not want all of these things. They had enough. The average American family in 1920 owned what they needed, bought what was necessary, replaced what was broken, and saved the rest. They were practical people, children of a Victorian age that valued thrift and modesty and restraint. They did not buy things to feel something. They bought things to use them. And this was a catastrophe for the men who owned the machines, because the machines could not stop. The entire system of industrial capitalism depended on one terrifying assumption, that there would always be someone willing to buy what the machines produced, and if people only bought what they needed, then the factories would slow, and the workers would be sent home, and the whole gleaming engine of American progress would grind to a halt. So the question that haunted the boardrooms and the smoke-filled offices of Madison Avenue in those early days of the 1920s was deceptively simple. How do you make people want things they do not need? How do you reach inside the human mind and plant a seed of desire where none existed before? How do you convince a man who is perfectly content with his old car that he is somehow incomplete without a new one? This question would reshape the entire world, and the answer would come from the most unlikely of places, from the writings of an elderly doctor in Vienna who spent his days listening to people talk about their dreams and their mothers and the dark, shameful things that lived in the basements of their minds. His name was Sigmund Freud, and he believed that human beings were not the rational creatures they pretended to be. He believed that beneath the polite surface of every person, beneath the handshakes and the table manners and the Sunday church clothes, there churned a hidden ocean of irrational desires, violent impulses, sexual hungers, and childhood fears that no amount of education or civilization could ever fully tame. He called this hidden place the unconscious, and he spent his entire career mapping its strange and terrifying geography, listening to patients for hours as they lay on his famous couch in Vienna, tracing the tangled roots of their anxieties back through childhood memories and half-forgotten dreams to the buried traumas that still controlled them from below. Freud argued that the human mind was divided against itself, split into warring factions that were forever locked in conflict. There was the id, the oldest and most primitive part, a screaming infant that wanted pleasure and wanted it now, that did not understand patience or morality or consequences. There was the superego, the internalized voice of parents and priests in society, always judging, always demanding restraint. And caught between them was the fragile ego, trying desperately to negotiate a truce, to find some way to satisfy the id's hungers without being destroyed by the superego's punishments. Most of this war, Freud believed, happened entirely outside of conscious awareness. You did not know why you felt anxious at parties, or why you were drawn to certain people, or why you craved things you could not name. The reasons lived in your unconscious, hidden behind locked doors that only dreams and free association and years of psychoanalysis could slowly pry open. Now, Freud himself had little interest in commerce. He was a doctor, a theorist, a man who dealt in neuroses and case studies and the interpretation of symbols. But he had a nephew, a young man born in Vienna and raised in New York, who looked at his uncle's theories and saw something that Freud himself had never imagined. He saw a weapon. His name was Edward Bernays, and he would become the most influential man of the 20th century that almost no one has ever heard of. Bernays was brilliant and ambitious, and utterly without the kind of moral hesitation that might have slowed a lesser man down. He had worked for the United States government during the war, helping Woodrow Wilson's Committee on Public Information sell the war to the American people, crafting propaganda that turned a distant European conflict into a holy crusade for democracy. He had watched, fascinated, as millions of people could be made to believe things, to feel things, to do things, simply by pressing the right psychological buttons. And when the war ended, Bernays looked at the returning soldiers and the humming factories and the mountains of unsold goods, and he asked himself a question that would change everything. If propaganda could sell a war, could it sell a product? Could the same techniques that had convinced young men to march into machine gun fire be used to convince their wives to buy a different brand of soap? Bernays believed the answer was yes, and he set about proving it with a kind of cold, clinical precision that would have made his uncle proud. He understood something that no one in advertising had ever fully grasped before. People do not make decisions with their rational minds. They do not weigh costs and benefits and carefully select the optimal choice. They decide with their feelings, with the dark, irrational forces that swirl through the unconscious, and then they invent rational explanations afterward to justify what their emotions have already chosen. This was Freud's great insight, translated from the therapist's couch to the marketplace, and it meant that the old way of advertising, the straightforward, informational approach that simply listed a product's features and benefits, was hopelessly naive. Telling a woman that your soap cleaned better than the competition was speaking to her rational mind, and her rational mind was not in charge. If you wanted to move her, to really move her, you had to speak to something deeper. You had to speak to her fears, her desires, her insecurities, the parts of herself she did not fully understand and could not fully control. You had to make her feel that buying your soap was not just a practical decision, but an emotional one, that it was somehow connected to who she was, to who she wanted to be, to the version of herself she saw in her most private and hopeful daydreams. Bernays did not call what he did advertising. He called it public relations, a term he essentially invented because he understood that the word advertising made people defensive, made them put up their guard, but the phrase public relations sounded neutral, almost civic-minded, as if he were performing a public service rather than engineering consent. And that phrase, engineering consent, was his own. He used it proudly. He believed that the masses were fundamentally irrational, that democracy was dangerous precisely because ordinary people could not be trusted to make good decisions, and that it was the duty of an intelligent elite to guide public opinion for the greater good. The fact that this guiding happened to be enormously profitable was, in his telling, merely a pleasant coincidence. His most famous demonstration of these principles came in 1929, and it remains one of the most audacious acts of psychological manipulation in the history of commerce. The American Tobacco Company came to Bernays with a problem. Women did not smoke, or rather, respectable women did not smoke. In the 1920s, a woman smoking a cigarette in public was committing a social transgression almost as shocking as public drunkenness. It was considered vulgar, unfeminine, even morally suspect, and this meant that the tobacco industry was leaving half the population's lungs untouched, half the population's money unspent, an entire market sealed shut by nothing more than a cultural taboo. They wanted Bernays to open it. A lesser mind would have created advertisements showing women smoking, perhaps with reassuring messages about how it was perfectly acceptable, perfectly ladylike, perfectly fine. But Bernays knew that a direct approach would fail. You cannot argue someone out of a taboo. Taboos live in the unconscious, enforced not by logic but by deep feelings of shame and social anxiety, and no amount of rational persuasion can reach them. Instead, you have to redefine the taboo itself. You have to change what the act means. So Bernays consulted a psychoanalyst, a man named Abraham Brill, and asked him what cigarettes meant to women in the unconscious mind. Brill told him that cigarettes were symbols of male power, phallic objects that represented the freedom and authority that women were denied in a patriarchal society. A woman smoking a cigarette was, symbolically, claiming male power for herself. She was rebelling against the structures that confined her. She was asserting her independence. Bernays took this insight and orchestrated one of the most carefully staged moments of public theatre the world had ever seen. On Easter Sunday, 1929, during the Grand Easter Parade on Fifth Avenue in New York City, a group of young, fashionable women suddenly reached into their purses, pulled out Lucky Strike cigarettes, and lit them in full view of the press photographers that Bernays had conveniently arranged to be present. He had told the newspapers in advance that a group of suffragettes were planning a dramatic protest, lighting what they called torches of freedom, and the papers, hungry for a story, covered it exactly as Bernays had intended. The next day, photographs of beautiful, defiant women smoking on Fifth Avenue appeared in newspapers across the country and around the world. The message was not by lucky strikes. The message was not even that smoking was acceptable. The message was far more subtle, far more powerful, and far more dangerous than that. The message was that smoking was an act of feminist rebellion, that a cigarette was a symbol of equality, that a woman who lit up in public was striking a blow against the patriarchy, claiming her freedom, asserting her right to occupy public space on the same terms as a man. Bernays had not sold a product. He had sold an identity. He had reached into the unconscious minds of millions of women and connected a cylinder of burning tobacco to their deepest yearnings for independence and equality and self-determination. He had made the cigarette mean something, and once it meant something, once it was wrapped in emotion and symbolism and the intoxicating feeling of liberation, no rational argument about health or propriety could compete. This was the birth of modern advertising, the moment when the industry crossed a threshold from which it would never return. Before Bernays, advertising spoke to the conscious mind. It said, "Our soap cleans better, our car runs faster, our bread is fresher." It presented facts and trusted the consumer to make a rational choice. After Bernays, advertising spoke to the unconscious. It said, "This soap will make you beautiful, this car will make you powerful, this bread will make your family love you." It did not sell products, it sold feelings, it sold fantasies. It sold the glittering, impossible promise that you could become someone else, someone better, someone more desirable, someone more complete, simply by handing over your money. And the transformation was total. Within a few years, every major corporation in America had absorbed Bernays' lessons, and the entire advertising industry had been remade in his image. The car was no longer transportation, it was masculinity, freedom, sexual potency, the open road stretching out before you like a promise. The dress was no longer clothing, it was desirability, sophistication, the magnetic pull of a woman who knows exactly who she is. The watch was no longer a timepiece, it was success, precision, the quiet confidence of a man who has arrived. Every product became a mirror reflecting back not what you were, but what you ache to be. Bernays understood something else too, something that would prove equally revolutionary. He understood that you could not simply satisfy desire. You had to create it. You had to manufacture dissatisfaction. You had to make people feel that what they already owned was insufficient, outdated, embarrassing, a mark of failure rather than a source of contentment. And the masters of this dark art were not the advertisers themselves, but the manufacturers, particularly the men who ran General Motors in the 1920s and 30s. Henry Ford had built the most successful automobile company in the world on a simple principle. Make one car, make it well, make it cheap, and sell it to everyone. The Model T was reliable, affordable, and virtually identical from year to year. Ford saw no reason to change a design that worked. He was an engineer, and engineers value function over form, substance over style. But Alfred Sloan, the president of General Motors, saw something that Ford did not. He saw that once everyone who needed a car had a car, the market would collapse, unless you could convince people who already owned perfectly good cars to buy new ones. And the way to do that was not to build a better car, but to build a different car, a car that looked new, that looked modern, that made last year's model look old and shabby and vaguely embarrassing by comparison. Sloan introduced the annual model change, a concept so revolutionary and so psychologically devastating that it would reshape not just the automobile industry, but the entire consumer economy. Every year, General Motors released new models with new styling, new colours, new chrome, new fins, new curves. The mechanical improvements were often negligible. The engine might be identical to last year's, but the body was different, and that was everything. Because the body was what other people saw, and what other people saw determined what they thought of you, and what they thought of you determined how you felt about yourself. Suddenly, driving a 3-year-old car was not a sign of thrift. It was a sign of failure. It meant you could not afford the new model, or worse, that you did not care enough about your own image to keep up. This was planned obsolescence in its most elegant and insidious form, not the crude version where products are designed to break, but the psychological version where products are designed to feel broken, to feel inadequate, to feel like they are no longer enough, even when they work perfectly well. Ford resisted for years, clinging stubbornly to his philosophy of building things to last. insisting that a good product would sell itself, that quality would always triumph over fashion. But he was wrong. General Motors surpassed him, and the lesson was brutal and unambiguous, a lesson that every corporation in America absorbed and never forgot. In a consumer economy, the companies that manufacture desire will always defeat the companies that merely manufacture products. The product does not matter. The feeling matters. The story matters. The dream matters. And this principle rippled outward, touching every corner of American life, creating a phenomenon that the philosopher Denis Diderot had unknowingly described 2 centuries earlier, a phenomenon that would later be given his name, the Diderot effect. In 1769, the French philosopher Denis Diderot wrote an essay called Regrets on Parting with My Old Dressing Gown. He had been given a beautiful new scarlet dressing gown, and at first he was delighted. But then he noticed that his old desk looked shabby next to the new gown. So he replaced the desk, but then the old curtains clashed with the new desk, so he replaced the curtains. And then the chair did not match the curtains, and the rug did not match the chair, and slowly, purchase by purchase, he replaced everything in his study until he was sitting in a room full of beautiful new things, drowning in debt, and somehow less happy than he had been before, in his old room, in his old gown, surrounded by his old, familiar, perfectly adequate possessions. This is the Diderot effect, the way one new purchase creates a cascade of dissatisfaction with everything you already own, the way a single thread, once pulled, can unravel an entire life of contentment. And the advertisers of the 1920s and 30s learned to pull that thread with exquisite precision. They did not just sell you a new dress, they sold you the awareness that your shoes did not match. They did not just sell you a new car, they sold you the realization that your driveway, your garage, your entire house was not worthy of the vehicle sitting in front of it. Every purchase was a doorway into further dissatisfaction, every product a mirror showing you not what you had but what you lacked. This was Bernays' world now, and he was not alone in shaping it. He had written the playbook, literally. In 1928, he published a book called Propaganda, and it is one of the most chilling documents of the 20th century, not because it reveals secrets, but because it states openly, almost cheerfully, what most people suspected but could not quite bring themselves to believe. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society, Bernays wrote. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. He was not apologizing. He was not confessing. He was not whispering these words in a darkened room to a trusted confidant. He published them in a book that anyone could buy at any bookstore in America. He was explaining, with the calm authority of a man who had seen behind the curtain and was perfectly comfortable with what he found there. A man who believed that manipulation was not a corruption of democracy, but a necessary condition for it. That the herd needed shepherds, and that he and his colleagues were merely performing a civic duty by providing direction to the directionless masses. The techniques he described were not new. Many of them had been used during the war, refined in the pressure cooker of global conflict, and then carried home like souvenirs by men who understood their power. Testimonials, the practice of having a trusted authority figure endorse a product, worked because human beings are social animals who take their cues from people they admire. If a doctor says this cigarette is safe, if a movie star says this face cream works, if a respected figure lends their name and their credibility to a product, the unconscious mind accepts the message without the critical scrutiny it would apply to an anonymous advertisement. The bandwagon effect exploited an even deeper instinct, the primal human fear of being left out, of being different, of standing alone while everyone else moves together as a group. When an advertisement told you that millions of Americans prefer this brand, it was not making a factual claim. It was issuing a threat. It was saying, everyone is doing this, and if you are not, then you are outside the group, you are alone, you are vulnerable. Association, the technique of linking a product to an unrelated but desirable concept, was perhaps the most Freudian of all. You could not rationally connect a car to sexual attractiveness, but you could photograph a beautiful woman draped across the hood, and the unconscious mind would make the connection automatically, effortlessly, irresistibly. The car would become associated with beauty, with desire, with the intoxicating possibility of being wanted, and no amount of conscious awareness could fully dissolve that association once it had been formed. And then there was repetition, the simplest and perhaps the most powerful technique of all. Say something once, and it is a claim. Say it twice, and it is familiar. Say it 100 times, and it is the truth, or at least it feels like the truth, which in the world of the unconscious is exactly the same thing. This phenomenon, which the psychologist Robert Zajonc would later study and name the mere exposure effect in 1968, is one of the most robust findings in all of psychology. The more you encounter something, the more you like it. It does not matter whether the thing is a word, a face, a shape, a melody, or a brand name. Sheer repetition breeds familiarity, and familiarity breeds a warm, comfortable feeling of preference that the conscious mind interprets as genuine liking. You think you prefer Coca-Cola because it tastes better, but part of the reason it tastes better is that you have seen the name Coca-Cola 10,000 times, on billboards and bottle caps and television screens and the sides of buildings, and each exposure has deposited a tiny grain of positive feeling in your unconscious, until the pile has grown so large that it feels like a genuine preference, a real choice, something that belongs to you rather than something that was put there by someone else. Bernays and his contemporaries understood this intuitively, decades before Zajonc proved it in a laboratory. They knew that if you repeated a message often enough, through enough channels, in enough different forms, it would eventually stop being a message and start being a belief. It would sink through the conscious mind, past the critical faculties, past the skepticism and the resistance, and settle into the unconscious like sediment at the bottom of a lake, invisible but always there, colouring every thought and every choice that passed through the water above it. By the time the Second World War began, these techniques had been refined to a sharp edge, tested on millions of consumers, and proven beyond any reasonable doubt. An entire generation of Americans had grown up swimming in this invisible ocean of influence, breathing it in without knowing it was there, making choices they believed were their own, but which had been carefully, patiently, expertly shaped by men they had never met and would never know. The war itself only accelerated the process. The same men who had crafted advertising campaigns now crafted war propaganda, applying every lesson they had learned about the unconscious mind to the task of mobilizing an entire nation. They sold war bonds the way they sold soap, with appeals to fear and pride and belonging. They recruited soldiers the way they sold cars, with images of heroism and masculinity and the irresistible promise of becoming something greater than yourself. And when the war ended, they came home to a country that was ready, almost desperately ready, to consume. The returning soldiers wanted houses, and they got them, miles and miles of identical suburban homes, stretching out across the landscape like a dream of normalcy. They wanted cars, and they got them, gleaming and chrome-plated and bigger every year. They wanted refrigerators and television sets and washing machines and all the shining appliances of a modern American life. And the factories, the same factories that had built the bombs and the planes and the tanks, pivoted overnight and began producing them in quantities that would have seemed obscene to their grandparents. This was the great consumer boom of the late 1940s and early 1950s, and it created a problem that was subtly different from the problem of the 1920s. In the 20s, the challenge had been to make people want things they did not need. In the 50s, people already wanted things. The war had created a pent-up hunger for comfort and normalcy and material abundance, and the economy was happy to feed it. But the new problem was deeper and stranger. People were buying, yes, but they did not always know why. They made choices that seemed irrational, that contradicted their stated preferences, that defied the neat economic models of rational self-interest. A woman would say she wanted the most effective laundry detergent, and then choose the one in the prettiest box. A man would say he wanted the most reliable car, and then buy the one with the most chrome. Something was happening beneath the surface of conscious decision-making, and the advertisers wanted to know what it was. Enter Ernest Dichter, the man who would become known as the father of motivational research. A Vienna-trained psychoanalyst who had fled the Nazis and arrived in America with a suitcase, a heavy accent, and an absolute conviction that Sigmund Freud held the key to understanding not just neurosis but commerce. Dichter was a small, energetic man with bright eyes and an almost evangelical enthusiasm for the hidden meanings of everyday objects. Where other researchers used surveys and focus groups and statistical analysis, Dichter used the psychoanalytic method. He sat people down in comfortable chairs and asked them to talk, not about what they bought, but about how they felt. He asked them about their childhoods, their dreams, their fears, their secret pleasures. He treated every purchase as a symptom, every brand preference as a clue, every consumer choice as a window into the deepest and most hidden chambers of the human psyche. And what he found there was extraordinary. He discovered that men did not buy convertible automobiles for practical reasons. A convertible was less safe than a hardtop, less weather-resistant, less sensible in every measurable way. But men bought them anyway, and when Dichter explored the unconscious motivations behind this choice, he found something that the automobile industry had never suspected. The convertible was a surrogate mistress. It was the other woman, the fantasy of youth and freedom and sexual adventure, the escape from the responsibilities of marriage and family and middle-aged routine. Men did not test drive convertibles. They fantasized about them, the way they might fantasize about an affair they would never actually have. And when they finally bought one, they felt a surge of illicit pleasure that had nothing to do with horsepower or handling, and everything to do with the secret, guilty, thrilling feeling of transgression. But here was the fascinating complication. Most men did not actually buy convertibles. They looked at them, they dreamed about them, they sat in them at the dealership with their hands on the wheel and their eyes half closed, and then they bought the sedan. Because the sedan was the wife. It was safe, reliable, practical, respectable. It was what a responsible man drove, and Dichter realized that the automobile industry needed both, needed the convertible in the showroom window to draw men in with the promise of fantasy, and the sedan on the lot to let them leave with their respectability intact. The fantasy sold the visit. The reality closed the deal. This was the kind of insight that made Dichter invaluable to corporations, and he produced dozens of them, each one more unsettling than the last. He told Ivory Soap that their product succeeded not because it was pure, though that was their advertising claim, but because washing with Ivory Soap was an unconscious ritual of purification, a symbolic cleansing of guilt and sin. Every shower was a small baptism, and Ivory Soap, white and floating and pure, was the instrument of absolution. He told the makers of Chrysler automobiles that the reason their cars appealed to older buyers was that the wide, heavy, chrome-laden design unconsciously reminded men of their mothers, broad and solid and reassuring, while the sleek European sports cars appealed to younger men because they reminded them of the women they desired, slim and fast and dangerous. Perhaps his most famous insight, the one that has been retold so many times it has become almost a legend in the advertising industry, concerned Betty Crocker cake mix. In the early 1950s, General Mills introduced an instant cake mix that required nothing more than adding water and putting the pan in the oven. It was a technological marvel, a genuine time-saver, a product that should have been an immediate success, but it was not. Women did not buy it. Sales were disappointing, and no one could understand why. The product worked. The cake tasted fine. The convenience was undeniable. So why were women resisting? General Mills called Dichter, and Dichter did what he always did. He talked to women. He listened. He probed beneath the surface of their stated objections and found the real reason hiding in the unconscious, curled up like a sleeping animal in the dark. The cake mix was too easy. It made women feel guilty. Baking a cake was not just a task. It was an act of love, a creative expression, a gift of time and effort and care. When a woman baked a cake from scratch, she was saying to her family, "I love you enough to spend my afternoon doing this." When she added water to a powder and put it in the oven, she was saying nothing. The ease of the product robbed the act of its emotional meaning. It took away the sacrifice, and without the sacrifice, the love could not be expressed. Dichter's solution was elegant and psychologically precise. He told General Mills to change the recipe. Take the powdered egg out of the mix. Make women add a real egg themselves. The additional effort was trivial in practical terms. It added perhaps 30 seconds to the preparation time. But in psychological terms, it was transformative. Adding an egg meant contributing something of yourself. It meant the cake was not entirely prefabricated. It meant there was still a crack, however small, through which love and effort and personal investment could enter. General Mills made the change, and the results were immediate and dramatic. Sales soared. Women were not buying convenience. They were buying permission to feel good about the convenience, permission to believe that they were still baking, still nurturing, still performing the ancient and essential act of feeding their families with their own hands. Dichter and his fellow motivational researchers were mapping the unconscious mind of the American consumer with a precision and a depth that Bernays had only dreamed of. They were reaching deeper than the surface desires, deeper than the obvious symbolism, all the way down to the fundamental anxieties and yearnings that shaped human behavior at its most basic level. The fear of death, the longing for love, the need for belonging, the terror of insignificance. These were the raw materials of consumer desire, and the advertisers of the early 1950s were learning to work with them the way a sculptor works with clay, shaping them, moulding them, turning them into forms that served the interests of commerce. And all of these techniques and insights and manipulations had been developed in a world of print advertisements and radio spots and billboard posters, a world where the advertiser could reach you through your eyes and your ears, but could not truly immerse you, could not surround you, could not enter your living room and sit down beside you and whisper directly into your mind. But that was about to change. By the early 1950s, something new was arriving in American homes, something that would make every previous tool of persuasion look quaint and primitive by comparison. In living rooms across the country, a new piece of furniture was appearing, heavy and wooden and crowned with a small luminous screen that cast a pale blue light across the faces of the families who gathered around it the way their ancestors had once gathered around fires in the darkness of a world they could not control. It was called television, and it would change everything. It would take every technique that Bernays and Dichter and their colleagues had developed over 3 decades and amplify them 1,000-fold, projecting them directly into the homes and minds of millions of people simultaneously, night after night after night. The age of mass manipulation was about to enter a new and terrifying chapter, and the human mind, already besieged by decades of increasingly sophisticated psychological warfare, was about to face an assault unlike anything it had ever experienced. But that is a story for another time. For now, let yourself rest with what you have learned. Let these ideas settle softly into your mind like snow falling on a quiet field, and know that understanding is the first step toward waking up, even as you drift gently, peacefully, inevitably towards sleep. The story is far from over. In some ways, it has only just begun. But for now, close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let the quiet wash over you like a tide retreating from the shore, carrying with it the noise and the urgency of the waking world, leaving behind only stillness and silence and the deep, restorative darkness of a mind at rest. And so we arrive at the moment when everything changed, when the flickering blue light first entered the American living room and nothing would ever be the same again. Imagine it now. Imagine a family in 1950, gathered in their modest home, the radio still warm in the corner, the newspapers folded on the kitchen table, and then this new object, this strange glowing box, takes its place in the center of the room like an altar, and the family arranges itself around it, and the images begin to move, and the voices begin to speak, and for the first time in the history of human civilization, a salesman can step inside your home without knocking, can sit beside you on your sofa, can whisper to you while your defenses are down, while you are relaxed, while you are half asleep, while you are wrapped in the warmth and safety of your own private world. Television was not merely a new medium for advertising, it was the most psychologically powerful tool of persuasion ever devised by human hands. And to understand why, you must understand what it did to the mind, how it bypassed the critical faculties in ways that print and radio never could. When you read a newspaper advertisement, your analytical mind is engaged. You're actively processing language. You're constructing meaning from symbols on a page, and in that construction there is a natural resistance, a filtering, a moment where the rational mind can say, no, I don't believe this, I don't need this. But television operated differently. It delivered its messages in a stream of light and sound that washed over you like warm water, asking nothing of you, requiring no effort, no construction, no critical engagement, and in that passivity lay its extraordinary power. By 1955, half of all American homes contained a television set, and by 1960, that number had climbed to nearly 90%, the fastest adoption of any technology in human history, faster than the telephone, faster than the automobile, faster than electricity itself, and with every new set that was plugged in and turned on, the advertising industry gained another household, another family, another collection of soft and receptive minds. For the first time, advertisers could show you the product in motion, could show you the cake rising in the oven, the car gliding down an open highway, the soap bubbles cascading over clean white skin, and with these images came music, carefully chosen music that wrapped around the visual message like silk, that triggered emotional responses before the conscious mind could even identify what it was feeling. The intimacy of television cannot be overstated, and as you lie here now, breathing slowly, letting your body settle deeper into rest, consider how strange it was, how unprecedented that families would willingly invite these persuaders into their most private spaces, into their bedrooms, into the rooms where they ate and slept and made love and raised their children, and they did so gladly, eagerly, because the entertainment was free, and the price was simply your attention, your beautiful, valuable, endlessly exploitable attention. The advertisers understood immediately what they had been given. They understood that a 30-second television commercial could accomplish what a full-page newspaper advertisement could not achieve in a lifetime, because television engaged multiple senses simultaneously, because it created what psychologists call a parasocial relationship, a one-sided intimacy where the viewer feels connected to the people on the screen, trusts them, likes them, wants to be like them, and this parasocial bond could be transferred effortlessly from the friendly announcer to the product he held in his hands. And it was into this landscape of unprecedented persuasive power that a quiet, bespectacled journalist named Vance Packard dropped a bomb. In 1957, Packard published a book called The Hidden Persuaders, and it became one of the most important and unsettling works of the 20th century. A book that pulled back the curtain on an industry that had been operating in shadow, that exposed to the American public the full scope and sophistication of the psychological manipulation being practiced upon them every single day. Packard had done something remarkable. He had gained access to the inner workings of Madison Avenue, had spoken to the depth psychologists and motivational researchers who were being hired at enormous expense to probe the unconscious desires of the American consumer, and what he revealed was deeply disturbing. He showed how researchers were using techniques borrowed from clinical psychotherapy, free association, projective tests, depth interviews, to discover the hidden emotional triggers that could be exploited to sell everything from automobiles to instant cake mix. He described how one study had discovered that women felt unconscious guilt about using instant cake mix because it felt like cheating, like they were not being good wives and mothers, and so the advertisers, rather than arguing against this guilt, rather than making a rational case for convenience, simply changed the recipe to require the addition of a fresh egg, one single egg, and this small act of participation, this tiny ritual of cracking and stirring, was enough to dissolve the guilt, to make the women feel that they had baked, that they had nurtured, that they had fulfilled their role, and the sales soared. Packard revealed how car manufacturers had discovered that men saw their automobiles as extensions of their masculinity, as mistresses on the side, as symbols of potency and power, and how this knowledge was used to design advertisements that spoke not to the rational need for transportation, but to the deep, primal desire for dominance and sexual attractiveness. The Hidden Persuaders created a national scandal. It was discussed in Congress. It was debated on television. It made Americans newly suspicious of the messages that surrounded them. And yet, and this is the paradox that should keep you thinking as you drift towards sleep, the book did not make advertising less manipulative. It made it more so. The exposure forced advertisers to become more sophisticated, more subtle, more skilled at hiding their techniques behind layers of apparent authenticity. Before Packard, advertisers could be relatively crude in their psychological manipulation because no one was watching. No one was looking for the strings. After Packard, they had to become artists of concealment. They had to make the manipulation so seamless, so embedded in the fabric of the entertainment, that even a suspicious viewer would struggle to see where the show ended and the sell began. And this refinement through exposure, this evolution through criticism, would become one of the great recurring patterns of the advertising industry. Every time someone pointed out the trick simply became more elegant. And it was in this same remarkable year, 1957, that the fear of advertising manipulation reached its absolute zenith, with a claim so sensational, so terrifying, that it embedded itself in the public consciousness and has never fully been dislodged. A market researcher named James Vicari called a press conference and announced that he had conducted an experiment in a movie theatre in Fort Lee, New Jersey, where he had used a special projector to flash the words "Drink Coca-Cola" and "Eat popcorn" on the screen for fractions of a second, intervals so brief that the conscious mind could not perceive them, and he claimed that this subliminal messaging had increased Coca-Cola sales by 18% and popcorn sales by an astonishing 58%. The reaction was immediate and volcanic. The public was horrified. Legislators demanded investigations. The CIA reportedly explored whether subliminal techniques could be weaponized, and a deep, abiding fear settled into the culture. The fear that invisible forces could reach into your mind and control your behavior without your knowledge or consent. But here is where the story takes a turn that is perhaps more interesting than the experiment itself, because James Vickery's experiment was a fraud. He later admitted that the study was a fabrication, that he had barely conducted any research at all, that the dramatic sales increases were invented, and when other researchers attempted to replicate his claims under controlled conditions, they found no evidence whatsoever that subliminal messages could influence purchasing behavior in any meaningful way. The science was clear, the experiment was a hoax, and yet, and let this thought settle over you like a heavy blanket, the belief persisted. It persists to this day. Millions of people remain convinced that subliminal advertising is real, that hidden messages are embedded in commercials and movies and music, and the question you should ask yourself as your eyelids grow heavy is why? Why do we want so desperately to believe in subliminal manipulation? Why is this myth so resistant to evidence and reason? The answer lies in a truth that is perhaps more uncomfortable than the myth itself. Because if subliminal advertising were real, if invisible messages could truly override our free will, then we would be victims, innocent and blameless, controlled by forces beyond our perception, and there is a strange comfort in victimhood, a relief in helplessness. But the truth, the real truth, is far more unsettling, because we are not being controlled by invisible messages, we are being persuaded by visible ones, and we are susceptible to this persuasion not because of some exotic technology, but because of the fundamental architecture of our own minds, our desires, our insecurities, our desperate need to belong, to be loved, to be enough. And it is so much easier, so much more bearable, to believe that we are being mind-controlled than to accept that we are simply, beautifully, heartbreakingly human, with all the vulnerability that implies. Let that thought rest now. Let it dissolve into the quiet of this moment, as we turn to one of the most fascinating case studies in the entire history of advertising psychology, a story so rich and so revealing that neuroscientists are still studying it decades later. It begins with two nearly identical brown liquids in two nearly identical cans, Coca-Cola and Pepsi, and the question that launched a billion-dollar war, which one tastes better? In 1975, Pepsi launched what it called the Pepsi Challenge, a series of blind taste tests conducted in shopping malls across America, where ordinary people were asked to sip from two unmarked cups and declare which they preferred. The results were consistent and devastating for Coca-Cola. In blind tests, a majority of people chose Pepsi. The sweeter taste of Pepsi, that immediate sugar rush on the tongue, won in the brief sip format of a taste test, and Pepsi trumpeted these results in television commercials, gleefully presenting the surprised faces of lifelong Coca-Cola drinkers who had just accidentally chosen the competition. But Coca-Cola remained the dominant brand, continued to outsell Pepsi by enormous margins, and this paradox, this gap between what people chose in blind tests and what they chose in stores, remained unexplained until 2004, when a neuroscientist named Red Montague designed an experiment that would illuminate the deepest truth about advertising's power over the human mind. Montague placed subjects in an fMRI machine, a device that could watch the brain in real time, could see which regions lit up with activity during different experiences, and he gave them the Pepsi challenge while their brains were being scanned. In the blind test, when subjects did not know which drink they were tasting, the ventral putamen, a region associated with pure taste reward, responded more strongly to Pepsi, confirming the original challenge results. Pepsi genuinely tasted better to most people when judged by taste alone. But then Montague did something elegant. He told the subjects which brand they were drinking before they tasted it, and everything changed. When people knew they were drinking Coca-Cola, a completely different set of brain regions activated. The medial prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, areas associated with memory, self-image, and emotional association, and these regions overwhelmed the taste centers. They literally altered the subjective experience of flavor, and now people preferred Coca-Cola. The brand, the logo, the decades of advertising, the polar bears and the Santa Claus and the hilltop singers, all of those associations stored in memory, were not merely influencing the choice, they were changing the taste. The Coca-Cola did not just seem better, it tasted better. It literally, neurologically, physiologically tasted better when you knew it was Coca-Cola. This is not metaphor, this is not exaggeration. This is what the brain scans showed, that advertising had reached so deeply into the neural architecture of these people that it had altered their sensory experience of reality itself. Think about that as you lie here in the darkness. Think about the extraordinary implication that the hundreds of billions of dollars spent on advertising over the decades had not merely changed what people bought, it had changed what they experienced. It had rewritten the relationship between the tongue and the brain, between sensation and perception, between the physical world and the felt world. And if a brand can change how something tastes, what else can it change? How you feel when you put on a certain pair of shoes, how confident you are when you carry a certain phone, how attractive you believe yourself to be when you spray a certain fragrance on your skin. And speaking of sensory experience, let us drift now into one of the most subtle and pervasive tools in the advertiser's arsenal, one that operates on you every single day in ways you almost certainly do not notice, and that is the psychology of colour. The next time you drive down a commercial strip, if you can call this image to mind, notice the colours of the fast food restaurants, the reds and yellows and oranges that blaze from their signs and their buildings and their packaging. And ask yourself whether this is coincidence, whether it is mere aesthetic preference, or whether it is something more deliberate, more calculated, more rooted in the deep wiring of the human brain. Red is the colour of urgency, of excitement, of appetite. It increases heart rate. It stimulates the adrenal glands. It has been shown in studies to make people eat faster and eat more. And this is why McDonald's and Burger King and Wendy's and KFC and so many others have wrapped themselves in red, because they do not want you to linger. They want you to feel hungry, to eat quickly, to leave and make room for the next customer. And the red accomplishes all of this without a single word being spoken. Yellow complements the red. It is the colour of happiness, of warmth, of childhood. It catches the eye faster than any other colour, which is why it dominates road signs and taxi cabs and the golden arches that have become one of the most recognised symbols on Earth. And together, red and yellow create a visual language that speaks directly to the limbic system, bypassing conscious thought entirely. Now contrast this with the palette of luxury, the blacks and golds and deep silvers of brands like Chanel and Rolex and Mercedes-Benz, colours that whisper rather than shout, that suggest exclusivity, scarcity, timelessness, wealth. The opposite of the urgent mass-market energy of fast food, because luxury brands do not want you to act quickly, they want you to aspire slowly, to save, to yearn, to feel that the purchase, when it finally comes, is an elevation, a transformation, an arrival at a higher plane of existence. And then there is blue, the colour of trust, of reliability, of calm rationality, and it is no accident that so many technology companies and financial institutions have chosen blue as their signature colour. Facebook and IBM and Intel and Samsung and PayPal and Chase and Citibank. Because these are industries that are asking you to trust them with your data, your money, your communications, the most sensitive aspects of your digital life. And blue says, trust me, I am stable, I am dependable, I will not betray you. And your brain receives this message and processes it and responds to it long before your conscious mind has even registered the colour. The debate among psychologists about how much of colour response is innate versus cultural continues to this day. Some associations appear to be hardwired. The response to red, for instance, may be connected to our evolutionary sensitivity to blood and fire and ripe fruit, while others are clearly learned. White means purity and mourning in different cultures, and the advertiser's genius lies not in discovering universal colour truths, but in understanding the specific associations of their specific audience, and exploiting those associations with surgical precision. And as these tools of colour and imagery and emotional association grew more sophisticated through the 1950s and 60s, they were organised into frameworks, into systems of persuasion that could be taught and replicated and refined. And the most enduring of these frameworks is known by a simple acronym, AIDA, 4 letters that contain the entire architecture of desire. Attention, interest, desire, action. These are the 4 stages through which every successful advertisement must guide you, and understanding them is like being given the blueprint to a machine that has been operating on you your entire life. First, attention. The advertisement must capture your gaze, must interrupt the flow of your distracted, overstimulated consciousness, and force you to look, to listen, to notice. And this is accomplished through novelty, through contrast, through surprise, through beauty, through shock, through any stimulus powerful enough to breach the walls of your inattention. Then interest. Having captured your attention, the advertisement must hold it, must offer something that engages your curiosity, that makes you want to know more, that creates a question in your mind that can only be answered by continuing to watch, to read, to listen. Then desire, and this is where the depth psychology enters, where the advertisement must connect the product not to your rational needs, but to your emotional wants, must make you feel that this thing, this object, this brand, will fill some emptiness inside you, will make you more complete, more attractive, more alive. And finally, action. The advertisement must compel you to do something, to buy, to call, to click, to visit the store, to reach for the product on the shelf, and every element of the advertisement, every colour, every word, every note of music, every facial expression of every actor, is calibrated to move you through these 4 stages as smoothly and as irresistibly as a river carries a leaf to the sea. And of those elements, perhaps none is more psychologically insidious than the jingle, that little melody that burrows into your brain and refuses to leave, that you find yourself humming in the shower or whistling while you walk, that replays itself in your mind unbidden and unwanted, carrying the brand name with it like a parasite riding its host. The scientific term for this is involuntary musical imagery, colloquially known as an earworm, and it exploits a fundamental feature of human memory. Our brains are wired to remember melodies, to complete unfinished musical phrases, to loop rhythmic patterns, and the jingle writers of Madison Avenue understood this intuitively long before the neuroscientists confirmed it. They knew that if they could attach a brand name to a catchy melody, that melody would replay itself in the consumer's mind hundreds of times, each repetition strengthening the association, each loop deepening the neural pathway, and all of this without the consumer's conscious cooperation or consent. This is related to a broader principle that underlies much of advertising's effectiveness, the mere exposure effect, first demonstrated by the psychologist Robert Zayonk, which shows that simply being exposed to something repeatedly makes us like it more, not because we have been given reasons to like it, not because we have been persuaded by arguments, but simply because familiarity itself generates positive feeling, because the brain interprets the ease of processing a familiar stimulus as a signal of safety, of goodness, of rightness. And so the advertisement that you see 100 times becomes, through sheer repetition, a source of comfort rather than irritation, and the product it represents becomes, in your mind, a trusted friend rather than a stranger trying to take your money. But even as these psychological principles were being codified and systematized, a revolution was brewing on Madison Avenue, a revolution that would transform not just advertising but the entire culture, and it was led by a quiet, passionate, deeply principled man named Bill Bernbach. In the early 1960s, American advertising was dominated by what was called the hard sell, advertisements that were loud and repetitive and insulting to the intelligence, that shouted their claims and pounded their slogans and treated the consumer as a passive vessel to be filled with product information. And Bernbach, working at his agency Doyle Dane Bernbach, known as DDB, looked at this landscape and saw an opportunity to do something entirely different, something that would respect the intelligence of the audience, that would treat advertising as a form of art, that would use wit and honesty and self-awareness to create a connection that brute repetition never could. The campaign that announced this revolution to the world was Think Small, created for Volkswagen in 1959, and it was a masterpiece of psychological judo, because here was a small, ugly foreign car being sold to a nation obsessed with big, beautiful American automobiles, and rather than trying to compete on those terms, rather than claiming that the Volkswagen Beetle was big or beautiful or powerful, the advertisement did something unprecedented. It admitted the truth. "Think small," said the headline, and beneath it sat a tiny photograph of the Beetle in the corner of a vast white page, and the body copy was witty and self-deprecating and honest, acknowledging that the car was small and funny-looking and foreign. And this honesty, this willingness to say what the consumer was already thinking, created a bond of trust that no amount of exaggeration could have achieved. Bernbach understood something profound about the psychology of persuasion, that in an environment saturated with claims and promises and superlatives, the most radical thing you could do was tell the truth, because truth was unexpected, truth was disarming, truth bypassed the defenses that consumers had built up against decades of hard-sell manipulation, and in that unguarded moment, when the consumer's critical faculties relaxed because they sensed they were being treated with respect, the real selling could begin. The creative revolution, as it came to be called, unleashed a torrent of brilliant, psychologically sophisticated advertising that used humour and irony and visual wit to create an entirely new relationship between brand and consumer, one based not on authority and repetition, but on shared intelligence, on the flattering implication that you, the consumer, were smart enough to get the joke, and this flattery, this subtle elevation of the audience, was itself a devastatingly effective form of manipulation, because who doesn't want to feel smart? Who doesn't want to feel that they are part of an in-group of sophisticated people who see through the obvious and appreciate the clever, and so the consumer, flattered and amused and disarmed, opened their wallet willingly, gratefully, feeling not that they had been sold to, but that they had been understood. And it was during this same turbulent decade, the 1960s, that advertising demonstrated its power in a new and terrifying arena, the arena of politics. On September 7th, 1964, during the presidential campaign between Lyndon Johnson and Barry Goldwater, a television commercial aired that would change political advertising forever. It is known as the Daisy ad, and it ran only once, a single broadcast on a single network, and yet it is one of the most famous and most studied advertisements in history. The ad opens on a little girl, perhaps 3 or 4 years old, standing in a meadow, plucking petals from a daisy, and counting them in the imperfect way that small children count. 1, 2, 3. And her voice is sweet and innocent and completely unaware of what is coming, and then a man's voice takes over, a cold, mechanical military voice, counting down 10, 9, 8. And the camera zooms into the child's eye, into the darkness of her pupil, and the screen fills with the blinding flash of a nuclear explosion, a mushroom cloud rising in terrible silence. And then Lyndon Johnson's voice says, "These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark, we must either love each other, or we must die." The ad never mentioned Barry Goldwater by name. It didn't need to. The association was already there, planted by weeks of news coverage about Goldwater's hawkish statements on nuclear weapons, and the Daisy ad simply activated that association, turned a political argument into a visceral emotional experience, fear, the most powerful motivator the human mind possesses, and in 60 seconds, without making a single factual claim, it defined Barry Goldwater as a man who would lead the world into nuclear annihilation. This was fear-based persuasion at its most elegant, and it revealed something crucial about the relationship between emotion and reason in the human mind. That we do not weigh evidence and then we feel and then seek evidence to support our feelings, and an advertisement that can trigger the right emotion, at the right intensity at the right moment, can make rational argument entirely irrelevant. The 60s also revealed another of advertising's most remarkable abilities, its capacity to absorb and neutralize the very forces that oppose it. The counterculture of the 1960s, the hippies and the radicals and the anti-establishment protesters who rejected consumerism and materialism and the entire American way of buying, might have seemed like advertising's greatest threat, but the industry, with the supple adaptability of a living organism, simply absorbed the rebellion and sold it back to the rebels. The language of revolution was used to sell soft drinks. The aesthetics of psychedelia were used to sell cigarettes. The values of authenticity and individuality and freedom were attached to products and brands, and within a few years, you could buy your counterculture at the mall. You could purchase your rebellion from the very corporations you claim to oppose, and the beautiful, terrible irony of this, the way that capitalism metabolizes its own criticism and converts it into profit, this is perhaps the most vivid demonstration of advertising's ultimate power, not just to sell products, but to absorb and redirect the deepest currents of human culture. And as the 60s gave way to the 70s, as the creative revolution matured and the tools of psychological manipulation grew ever more refined, a fundamental shift occurred in the nature of what was being sold. It was no longer enough to sell a product, to enumerate its features, to demonstrate its benefits, to argue for its superiority, because in a marketplace crowded with nearly identical products, features and benefits were no longer sufficient to differentiate one brand from another, and so advertisers began to sell something far more powerful, far more intimate, far more psychologically compelling than any product. They began to sell identity. The most dramatic example of this transformation is the story of the Marlboro Man, and it is a story so extraordinary that it reads like fiction. In the early 1950s, Marlboro was a women's cigarette. It was marketed with the slogan "mild as May." It had a red filter tip designed to hide lipstick stains, and its market share was negligible, a footnote in the cigarette industry. And then the Leo Burnett agency was hired, and they created the Marlboro Man, a rugged cowboy on horseback in the vast American West, and in one stroke, one single creative decision, they transformed Marlboro from a feminine afterthought into the best-selling cigarette brand in the world. The Marlboro Man did not talk about tobacco quality or filter technology or price. He said nothing at all. He simply existed, silent and strong and free, and his message was not buy this cigarette, but be this man, be rugged, be independent, be powerful, be free of the soft domesticated world of offices and suburbs and compromises, and millions of men reached for the red and white pack. Not because they had been persuaded by an argument, but because they had been offered an identity, a vision of who they could become, and the cigarette was merely the token, the entry fee, the physical object that connected them to that vision. This is what psychologists call self-concept maintenance, the tendency of human beings to seek out and purchase products that align with their self-image, or more precisely, with the self-image they aspire to. And once advertisers understood this principle, once they realized that people buy not products but versions of themselves, the entire game changed, because now the competition was not between products, but between identities, between visions of the good life, between answers to the most fundamental human question, who am I, and who do I want to become? This insight was not limited to cigarettes. In the 1970s, Nike was a small running shoe company selling to serious athletes. But Phil Knight and his team understood that the future lay not in selling shoes, but in selling the idea of athleticism, the dream of the body in motion, the aspiration of strength and speed and discipline, and they began to build a brand that would transcend footwear entirely, that would become a symbol of human potential. And when you bought a pair of Nikes, you were not buying rubber and leather and nylon. You were buying a promise that you were the kind of person who pushes harder, who goes further, who refuses to quit. And this promise, this identity, was worth far more than any shoe. And across the country, in a garage in California, a young man named Steve Jobs was beginning to build a company that would take lifestyle branding to heights that even the Marlboro Man could not have imagined, because Apple would eventually sell not just identity but belonging, not just a vision of the self but membership in a tribe, a community of people who saw themselves as creative, as different, as revolutionary. And the products, the beautiful, meticulously designed products, would become totems of tribal membership, signals to the world that said, I'm not like the others, I think differently, I'm special. And the premium price, the thousands of extra dollars that people would pay for technology that was functionally similar to cheaper alternatives, that premium was not the cost of better hardware, it was the cost of identity, the price of admission to the tribe. As the 1970s drew to a close, the advertising industry had travelled an extraordinary distance from the simple product announcements of a century before. It had moved from selling things to selling dreams, from describing features to constructing identities, from informing the rational mind to colonizing the emotional self, and the tools it had developed, the psychological insights it had accumulated, the creative techniques it had refined, were more powerful and more sophisticated than anything Edward Bernays or Ernest Dichter could have imagined in their most ambitious moments. Television had given advertisers access to the most intimate spaces of human life, the living room, the bedroom, the family dinner table. Depth psychology had given them a map of the unconscious mind. Color theory had given them a palette of emotional triggers. The Ada model had given them an architecture of desire. The creative revolution had given them the art of disarming honesty. And lifestyle branding had given them the ultimate product, identity itself, the answer to the question that every human being carries inside them. Who am I? Who am I? Who am I? And yet, as the decade turned and the first personal computers began to hum in basements and bedrooms across the country, as the earliest networks began to connect machine to machine in the quiet laboratories of universities, a new age was dawning, an age that would make everything that had come before seem quaint and primitive, because the digital revolution was about to give advertisers something they had always dreamed of but never possessed: the ability to watch you, to follow you, to learn your habits and your preferences and your secrets, not as a demographic, not as a market segment, not as a generalized consumer type, but as you, as an individual, as a single, unique point of data in an ocean of data. And this capability, this intimate surveillance, would transform advertising from a broadcast art into a precision science, from a shotgun blast into a laser beam, and nothing, not your privacy, not your autonomy, not your sense of self, nothing would remain untouched. But that is a story for another night. And for now, let these thoughts settle like sediment in still water. Let the names and the stories and the revelations drift through your mind without urgency. Vance Packard and his hidden persuaders, James Vickery and his phantom messages, the Pepsi challenge and the brain scans that revealed what we always suspected but could never prove, that advertising changes not just what we choose, but what we experience. That the brand is not on the product but in the mind. That we are not simply buying things, we are buying ourselves, constructing ourselves, assembling an identity from the raw materials that the advertisers have so thoughtfully, so generously, so relentlessly provided. And as your breathing slows and your thoughts begin to dissolve at the edges, as the boundary between waking and sleeping grows soft and permeable, carry with you this final thought, this gentle, unsettling, strangely comforting truth, that the most powerful advertisement ever created is the one you cannot see, the one that has become so thoroughly woven into the fabric of your identity that you mistake it for who you are, and perhaps in the quiet honesty of this half-sleeping moment, you can begin to ask yourself which parts of you are truly yours and which were placed there, carefully, deliberately, lovingly, by someone who had something to sell. As the 1980s dawned across the Western world, something shifted in the air, something you could almost taste if you were alive in that era. A kind of electricity that hummed beneath the surface of everyday life. A feeling that the rules had changed, that restraint was no longer a virtue but a weakness, that wanting more was not just acceptable but admirable, even heroic. Ronald Reagan stepped into the White House in January of 1981, and with him came a philosophy that would reshape not just American politics, but the very psychology of consumption itself. A worldview that celebrated wealth as proof of worth, that treated the marketplace as a cathedral, that whispered to millions of people that greed, far from being a sin, was actually good. And advertising, that ever-adaptable creature, that mirror held up to the desires of the age, absorbed this new spirit like a sponge absorbing water, and it grew bolder, louder, more aggressive, more shameless than it had ever been before. The decade of excess had arrived, and with it came a new chapter in the long, strange history of how advertisers have learned to reach inside your mind and rearrange the furniture. Picture yourself in a living room in 1983, perhaps late at night, the house quiet, the rest of the family asleep, and you're flipping through channels on a television that now offers not just 3 or 4 options, but dozens, thanks to the spread of cable, and you land on something unusual, something that does not look quite like a regular program and does not look quite like a regular commercial either. It is longer than a commercial, running perhaps 30 minutes, and it has a host who speaks directly to you with an intimacy and an urgency that feels almost uncomfortable, holding up a product, demonstrating it, praising it, and then telling you that you must act now, right now, because this offer will not last, because supplies are limited, because if you pick up that telephone and dial the number on your screen in the next 15 minutes, you will receive not just the product, but a second one absolutely free. This was the infomercial, and it was one of the defining inventions of 1980s advertising, a format that took the principles of direct response marketing and stretched them across an entire half hour of television, creating a kind of hypnotic selling environment, where every psychological lever was pulled simultaneously and with great force. The infomercial pioneers understood something profound about human psychology, something that a brilliant social psychologist named Robert Cialdini was, at that very moment, carefully documenting in his research at Arizona State University. They understood that urgency is a drug, that when you tell a person they have limited time to act, something changes in their brain. A switch flips. The careful, deliberative, rational mind steps aside and a more primitive system takes over. One driven by fear, by the terror of missing out, by the ancient biological imperative that whispers you must grab this resource now before it disappears forever. The phrases became iconic, almost comedic in their transparency, yet they worked with devastating effectiveness. Call now, operators are standing by, this offer expires at midnight. But wait, there is more. Limited time offer, only while supplies last. Act now, and we will double your order. Each of these phrases was a small psychological weapon, a carefully crafted trigger designed to bypass your rational defenses and speak directly to the part of your brain that fears loss, that dreads scarcity, that cannot bear the thought of an opportunity slipping through its fingers like sand. And as you lie here tonight, breathing slowly, letting the weight of the day dissolve from your shoulders, consider how remarkable it is that these same phrases, born in the garish, neon-lit world of 1980s television, are still being used today in emails, on websites, in app notifications, because the underlying psychology has not changed one bit, because your brain in this moment is wired in exactly the same way as the brain of that person sitting in their living room in 1983 reaching for the telephone. Now let's turn our attention to the man who did more than perhaps anyone else to explain why these tactics work, a man whose 1984 book would become one of the most important texts ever written about the psychology of persuasion. Robert Cialdini was not an advertiser. He was a scientist, a social psychologist who spent years conducting experiments and, crucially, going undercover, embedding himself in the world of salespeople, fundraisers, con artists, and yes, advertisers, to understand the fundamental principles that govern how human beings are influenced. What he discovered, and what he laid out with extraordinary clarity in his book Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion, was that all of the thousands of tactics used to persuade people could be distilled down to 6 core principles, 6 deep channels carved into the bedrock of human psychology by millions of years of evolution, and that anyone who understood these 6 principles held a kind of skeleton key to the human mind. The first principle Cialdini identified was reciprocity, and it is perhaps the most elegant and the most insidious of them all. Reciprocity is simply the deeply ingrained human instinct that when someone gives you something, you feel obligated to give something back. It sounds innocent enough, even noble, a foundation of cooperation and social harmony. But in the hands of advertisers, reciprocity becomes a precision tool for manipulation. Think about the free sample, that tiny cube of cheese on a toothpick at the grocery store, that small cup of coffee offered to you as you walk past a new cafe, that free trial of software that lets you use every feature for 30 days before asking you to pay. These are not acts of generosity. They are investments, carefully calculated gestures designed to plant a seed of obligation in your mind, because Cialdini's research showed that once you accept something free, a psychological debt is created, a subtle but powerful feeling that you now owe the giver something in return, and that something is usually a purchase. The free sample works not because it lets you taste the product, though that helps, but because it makes you feel, at a level below conscious awareness, that it would be rude, that it would be wrong, that it would violate some deep social contract to simply walk away without buying. The second principle was commitment and consistency, the finding that once a person takes a small step in a particular direction, they feel a powerful internal pressure to continue in that direction, to remain consistent with what they have already done. Advertisers exploit this constantly. Get a customer to sign up for a free newsletter, and they are more likely to buy a product later. Get them to fill out a survey about their preferences, and they are more likely to feel invested in your brand. Get them to say yes to a small request, and the door is open to larger requests down the line. This is the foot in the door technique, and it works because human beings have a deep need to see themselves as consistent, to feel that their actions form a coherent narrative, and once they have taken that first step, walking it back feels like a kind of self-betrayal. The third principle was social proof, the tendency of human beings to look at what other people are doing and use that as a guide for their own behaviour, especially in situations of uncertainty. This is why advertisements have always loved to tell you that their product is the best-selling, the most popular, the one that everyone is choosing. 9 out of 10 dentists recommend this toothpaste. Millions of satisfied customers, America's #1 brand. These claims work not because you trust dentists or care what millions of strangers think, but because your brain contains an ancient heuristic, a mental shortcut forged in the prehistoric savannas where your ancestors lived. A shortcut that says if everyone else is doing something, it is probably safe, it is probably good, it is probably the right choice. Social proof is the reason laugh tracks work on television comedies, the reason restaurants seat customers near the window so passers-by can see that the place is popular, the reason online retailers show you how many people are looking at a product right now. Your brain sees the crowd and follows it, often without you ever realizing that a decision has been made. The fourth principle was authority, the deeply rooted human tendency to defer to people who appear to be experts or who hold positions of power. This is why the actor in the white lab coat selling you pain relief medication is so effective. Even though some part of you knows he's an actor, even though you know the lab coat is a costume. The symbols of authority, the coat, the title, the confident tone of voice, the statistics cited with precision. These bypass your critical faculties and speak to a part of your brain that evolved in a world where deferring to the knowledgeable elder, the experienced hunter, the wise healer, was often the difference between life and death. Celebrity endorsements work through a combination of authority and the fifth principle, liking. We are more easily persuaded by people we like, people we find attractive, people who seem similar to us, people who pay us compliments. This is why advertisers spend millions of dollars to put a famous face next to their product. Because when you see an athlete you admire drinking a particular sports drink, your brain does not engage in a careful analysis of the drink's nutritional profile. Instead, it makes a fast unconscious association. I like this person likes this product, therefore I should like this product too. It is not logic. It is something far older and far more powerful than logic. And the sixth principle, the one that brings us back to those late-night infomercials, was scarcity. The finding that people assign more value to things that are rare, limited, or in danger of disappearing. Cialdini demonstrated through experiment after experiment that the same product, the same opportunity, the same offer becomes dramatically more attractive the moment people believe it might not be available tomorrow. This is not rational. A cookie does not taste better because it is the last one in the jar. A coat is not warmer because it is the last one on the rack. But your brain does not care about rationality in these moments. It cares about survival, about securing resources, about not being the one who missed out. And advertisers have exploited this instinct with ruthless efficiency for decades, creating artificial scarcity where none exists, manufacturing urgency out of thin air, counting down clocks that reset when you refresh the page. Cialdini's 6 principles were not new discoveries in the sense that advertisers had never used them before. People had been exploiting reciprocity and scarcity and social proof for centuries. What Cialdini did was name them, categorize them, prove them scientifically, and in doing so he handed the advertising industry a textbook, a field manual for the manipulation of the human mind, and the industry embraced it with open arms. As you breathe in slowly and let these ideas settle over you like a warm blanket, let us move forward into another dimension of the advertising revolution that was taking shape during this era, the rise of what we might call branding science, the systematic, almost academic study of how brands work in the human mind. Throughout most of advertising history, a brand was simply a name, a logo, a jingle, a set of visual cues that helped you recognize one product and distinguish it from another. But in the 1980s and 1990s, a group of thinkers began to reconceive of brands as something far more complex and far more powerful, as living entities that occupied space inside your mind, that had personalities and values and emotional resonances, that existed not on shelves or in factories but in the neural pathways of millions of consumers. One of the most influential ideas to emerge from this period was positioning theory, articulated by Al Ries and Jack Trout in their landmark work. Ries and Trout argued that the battle for customers was not fought in stores or on television screens, but inside the mind, and that the key to winning that battle was to be the first brand to occupy a particular category in the consumer's mental landscape. Their insight was deceptively simple, but profoundly important. The first brand to claim a position in your mind tends to hold that position forever, becoming so deeply associated with a category that the brand name and the category become interchangeable. Think about this for a moment as you lie here in the quiet darkness. When you cut your finger, you reach for a band-aid. even though Band-Aid is a brand name and what you actually need is an adhesive bandage. When you need to blow your nose, you reach for a Kleenex, even though Kleenex is a brand and what you need is a facial tissue. When you want to find something on the internet, you Google it, even though Google is a company and what you're doing is performing a search query. These brands have achieved something extraordinary, something that most brands can only dream of. They have become the category itself. They have colonized a piece of mental territory so thoroughly that no competitor can dislodge them, because to dislodge them would require not just changing your preference, but rewiring the very language you use to describe the world. This is what brand positioning means at its deepest level, not just being preferred, but being synonymous, not just being chosen, but being the only thing your brain can even conceive of when it thinks about a particular need. Building on these ideas, scholars like Kevin Keller developed increasingly sophisticated models for understanding how brands take root in the mind. Keller's brand resonance model described a pyramid of brand building, starting at the base with simple brand identity. Does the consumer know this brand exists? Then moving up through brand meaning. What does the consumer think this brand stands for? Then brand response. What does the consumer feel about this brand? And finally, at the apex, brand resonance. The deepest level of connection, where the consumer feels not just loyalty, but a genuine relationship with the brand, a sense of community with other users, an active engagement that goes beyond mere purchasing. Keller understood that the brands that reach this apex, brands like Apple, like Harley-Davidson, like Nike, have achieved something that transcends marketing. They have become part of their customer's identity. To criticize the brand is to criticize the person. To abandon the brand is to abandon a piece of oneself. And this perhaps is the most sophisticated form of persuasion ever devised. The creation of a bond so deep that the consumer does not feel manipulated at all, but rather feels grateful, feels understood, feels that they have found something that truly represents who they are. Alongside these models of brand building, researchers began developing the concept of brand archetypes, the idea that successful brands tend to embody universal character types, drawn from mythology and psychology. Archetypes like the hero, the rebel, the sage, the caretaker, the explorer, the creator. Nike is the hero, urging you to just do it, to push beyond your limits. Harley-Davidson is the outlaw, promising freedom from convention. Apple is the creator, celebrating those who think different. Disney is the magician, making dreams come true. These archetypes work because they tap into something deep in the human psyche. Patterns of meaning that have been part of human storytelling for thousands of years. And when a brand aligns itself with one of these archetypes, it gains a kind of mythological power, a resonance that goes far beyond the functional qualities of whatever product it happens to sell. The study of brands had become, by the late 1990s, a fully fledged science, with its own journals, its own conferences, its own tenured professors, and its own increasingly sophisticated tools. And it was this growing scientific ambition, this desire to truly understand what was happening inside the consumer's brain, rather than merely guessing, that led to the birth of one of the most fascinating and unsettling developments in the entire history of advertising, the field known as neuromarketing. Let your body sink a little deeper now. Let your breathing slow and consider this. For all of the sophistication of 20th century advertising, for all of the billions of dollars spent, for all of the creative genius deployed, there was always a fundamental problem that advertisers could not solve. They could never truly know what was happening inside the consumer's mind. They could ask people questions in focus groups and surveys, but people lie, not always deliberately, but reliably. They say they care about nutrition when they actually care about taste. They say they buy based on quality when they actually buy based on what their friends buy. They say they are not influenced by advertising when they are profoundly influenced by it. The gap between what people say and what they actually think, feel, and do has always been the great frustration of the advertising industry. And in the late 1990s, a Harvard professor named Gerald Zaltman believed he had found a way to close that gap. Zaltman's insight was that the tools of neuroscience, technologies like functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, and electroencephalography, or EEG, which had been developed to study brain disorders and cognitive function, could be turned toward a very different purpose. They could be used to watch the brain as it encountered advertisements, brands, products, and prices, to see in real time which regions lit up with activity, to measure emotional responses that the conscious mind might not even be aware of, and to bypass the unreliable filter of language and self-report entirely. This was the birth of neuromarketing, and it carried with it a claim that was both thrilling and terrifying in its implications. Zaltman estimated that fully 95% of all purchasing decisions are made not by the conscious, rational, deliberating mind, but by unconscious processes, by emotional reactions, by habits, by associations that operate below the threshold of awareness. 95%. If this estimate is even approximately correct, and subsequent research has generally supported the idea that unconscious factors dominate consumer behavior, then it means that the vast majority of what you buy, from your morning coffee to your car to the shirt on your back, was not really chosen by you in any meaningful sense. It was chosen by a part of your brain that you do not have direct access to, a part that responds to colours and shapes and sounds and smells and social cues and emotional memories, a part that advertisers were now learning to study, to understand, and to influence with unprecedented precision. In the years that followed Zaltman's pioneering work, neuromarketing grew rapidly. Companies sprang up offering to test advertisements by scanning the brains of volunteers, producing maps of neural activation that claimed to show exactly which moments in a commercial captured attention, which generated desire, which triggered anxiety, and which were simply ignored. Martin Lindstrom, a branding consultant who became one of the field's most prominent popularizers, conducted a large-scale neuromarketing study that he documented in his 2008 book Biology: Truth and Lies About Why We Buy. Lindstrom's research revealed findings that would have shocked the advertising pioneers of a century earlier. He found, for instance, that health warnings on cigarette packages, far from discouraging smoking, actually stimulated the nucleus accumbens, a region of the brain associated with craving and reward, effectively making smokers want a cigarette more, not less. He found that brand logos often had less impact on brain activity than sensory cues like sounds and smells, suggesting that the most powerful branding operates through channels that bypass visual processing entirely. He found that product placement in television shows and movies was far less effective than the industry believed, unless the product was deeply integrated into the narrative in a way that felt organic and meaningful. Biology and the neuromarketing movement it represented did not just give advertisers new tools, it gave them a new way of thinking about what advertising is and what it does. Advertising was no longer about communicating information, or even about creating emotional associations. It was about engineering neural responses, about triggering specific patterns of brain activity that reliably lead to purchasing behavior, about reaching past the conscious mind entirely and speaking to the brain in its own language, a language of dopamine and cortisol, of amygdala activation and prefrontal cortex suppression, a language that you, the person lying here listening to these words, cannot hear, cannot translate, and cannot defend against, because it was never meant for the part of you that thinks and reasons and chooses. It was meant for the part of you that simply responds. And now, as your muscles continue to relax and the world outside this moment fades a little further away, let us explore one of the most powerful psychological forces that advertisers learned to harness during this era. A force that shapes not just what you buy, but how you perceive value itself. In 1979, two psychologists named Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky published a paper called Prospect Theory, an analysis of decision under risk, a paper that would eventually help earn Kahneman the Nobel Prize in Economics, and that would fundamentally change our understanding of how human beings make decisions. At the heart of prospect theory was a simple but revolutionary finding. Losses and gains are not symmetrical in the human mind. The pain of losing something is roughly twice as powerful as the pleasure of gaining something of equivalent value. Lose a $20 bill, and the sting you feel is approximately twice as intense as the satisfaction you would feel from finding a $20 bill on the sidewalk. This asymmetry, which Kahneman and Tversky called loss aversion, is not a quirk or an anomaly. It is a fundamental feature of human psychology, almost certainly rooted in evolutionary pressures that made our ancestors more sensitive to threats than to opportunities, because in a world of genuine scarcity, losing a day's food could mean death, while gaining an extra day's food merely meant comfort. Loss aversion, once understood, became one of the most potent weapons in the advertiser's arsenal. Consider the difference between two messages. The first says, buy our security system and enjoy peace of mind. The second says, without our security system you could lose everything you have worked for. Both messages are promoting the same product, but the second is dramatically more effective because it speaks to loss aversion, because it frames the decision not as an opportunity to gain something pleasant, but as a chance to avoid losing something precious. This is why insurance advertising has always been so effective at selling fear rather than comfort. It is why advertisements for health products focus on what you might lose, your mobility, your independence, your years with your grandchildren, rather than what you might gain. It is why the phrase "do not miss out," which would become the foundation of an entire culture of marketing in the digital age, is so much more powerful than the phrase "you could benefit." Long before the acronym FOMO entered the popular vocabulary, advertisers were already exploiting fear of missing out with surgical precision because they understood, whether intuitively or through research, that the human brain is wired to respond more urgently to the threat of loss than to the promise of gain. Loss aversion also explains one of the most elegant and effective tactics in modern marketing: the free trial. When a software company offers you 30 days of free access to their premium product, they are not simply letting you test the software. They are exploiting a phenomenon that behavioral economists call the endowment effect, the finding that people assign more value to things they already possess than to identical things they do not yet possess. Once you have used that software for 30 days, once you have customized your settings and uploaded your files and integrated it into your workflow, it is no longer just a product you are evaluating. It is yours. It belongs to you. And giving it up, even though you never paid for it, even though it was always designated as temporary, feels not like declining to purchase something but like losing something you already own. The free trial works because it shifts the psychological frame from gaining to losing, from an opportunity to a threat. And that shift, that subtle reframing, is worth billions of dollars in annual revenue to the companies that employ it. Breathe in slowly now, and let us venture into another territory where psychology and commerce intertwine in ways that most people never notice. The territory of pricing, where the numbers on a tag are never just numbers, but carefully constructed psychological signals designed to shape your perception of value. One of the most well-documented phenomena in pricing psychology is anchoring, a cognitive bias identified by Kahneman and Tversky, in which the first number a person encounters in a decision-making context disproportionately influences their subsequent judgments. Anchoring explains why a $100 shirt hanging next to a $500 shirt seems like a reasonable purchase, even though the same $100 shirt hanging next to a $30 shirt seems extravagant. The first price you see becomes an anchor, a reference point against which all subsequent prices are unconsciously compared, and advertisers and retailers have learned to manipulate this anchor with extraordinary sophistication. Luxury brands understood this instinctively, placing their most expensive items at the front of the store, not because they expect most customers to buy them, but because those prices establish an anchor that makes everything else in the store seem affordable by comparison. Wine lists at expensive restaurants routinely feature a few bottles priced at several $100s, not because the restaurant expects to sell many of them, but because those prices make the $60 bottle seem like a sensible, moderate choice. Starbucks, the coffee chain that transformed a $2 commodity into a $5 experience, placed its most elaborate and expensive drinks at the top of its menu boards, so that by the time your eye travelled down to the merely expensive options, they seemed almost economical. Anchoring is everywhere once you learn to see it, and what makes it so powerful is that knowing about it does not protect you from it. Even people who understand anchoring, even researchers who study it, are still influenced by it, because it operates at a level of cognition that conscious awareness cannot easily override. Closely related to anchoring is the decoy effect, one of the most ingenious pricing strategies ever devised. The decoy effect, also known as asymmetric dominance, works like this. Imagine you walk into a movie theatre and you're offered two sizes of popcorn, a small for $5 and a large for $7. Many people will choose the small because the large seems expensive by comparison. But now imagine the theatre adds a third option, a medium for $6.50. Suddenly the large, which is only 50 cents more than the medium and significantly bigger, seems like an obvious bargain. The medium is the decoy. It was never meant to be chosen. It exists solely to make the large look like a better deal, to shift your perception of value, to nudge you toward the more expensive option by providing an unfavorable comparison point. This strategy is used constantly in consumer pricing, from software subscription tiers to magazine subscriptions to electronics. The Economist magazine famously offered 3 subscription options: online only for $59, print only for $125, and print plus online for $125. The print-only option, priced identically to the print plus online option, was the decoy, and it was brilliant because it made the combined subscription seem like an incredible deal. You get the online version for free, and it dramatically increased the number of people who chose the most expensive option. When behavioral economist Dan Ariely tested this by removing the decoy option, the percentage of people choosing the premium subscription dropped dramatically. The decoy had been doing its silent, invisible work, shaping choices without anyone realizing they were being shaped. And then there is charm pricing, perhaps the most ubiquitous and the most seemingly trivial of all pricing psychology tactics, yet one that has proven remarkably durable over more than a century of use. Charm pricing is simply the practice of setting prices just below a round number, $9.99 instead of $10, $19.95 instead of $20, $299 instead of $300. Research has consistently shown that charm pricing increases sales, sometimes dramatically, and the reasons are both fascinating and slightly humbling. One explanation is the left digit effect. Your brain processes the first digit of a price more intensely than the subsequent digits, so $9.99 is perceived as being closer to $9 than to $10, even though it is only 1 cent less than 10. Another explanation is that non-round prices signal that the product has been carefully priced, that the seller has calculated the lowest possible price, which creates an impression of value. Whatever the precise mechanism, charm pricing works, and it has become so universal that its absence is itself a signal. Luxury brands deliberately use round numbers, $100 instead of $99.99, because the round number signals that the brand is above the psychological tricks of the mass market, which is, of course, its own form of psychological trick. As you rest here, letting these ideas wash over you like gentle waves, let us arrive at the final great transformation covered in this chapter of our story, a transformation so vast and so consequential that it makes everything that came before it seem almost quaint by comparison. In the mid-1990s, the internet began its slow, then sudden, then overwhelming infiltration of everyday life, and with it came a revolution in advertising that would make the previous century of innovation look like a prologue. The first banner advertisement appeared on the World Wide Web on October 27, 1994, on a site called Hotwired, the online companion to Wired magazine. It was a simple, colourful rectangle placed by AT&T, and it asked, in a tone of cheerful provocation, "Have you ever clicked your mouse right here?" Remarkably, 44% of the people who saw it did click on it, a response rate that would seem almost mythological to digital advertisers today, when a click-through rate of 1% is considered excellent. But that first banner ad was important not because of its content or its click rate, but because of what it represented, the beginning of a fundamental shift in the relationship between advertisers and consumers. For the first time in the history of advertising, the interaction was not one-directional. The consumer could respond, could click, could be tracked, could be measured, not as part of a vague demographic group, but as an individual, a specific person with a specific browsing history, specific interests, specific behaviors, specific vulnerabilities. The early internet advertising landscape was, to put it gently, chaotic. Pop-up ads appeared uninvited, multiplying across your screen like aggressive weeds, each one spawning 2 more when you tried to close it. Flashing banner ads competed for attention with increasingly desperate tactics, growing larger, more colourful, more animated, more intrusive, in a relentless arms race for your eyeballs. It was, in many ways, the digital equivalent of the carnival barker, crude and annoying and easy to dismiss. But beneath this noisy surface, something far more significant was happening. Quietly, invisibly, a new infrastructure of surveillance was being built, an infrastructure of small text files called cookies that were placed on your computer by the websites you visited, recording where you went, what you looked at, how long you stayed, what you clicked on, and what you bought. Cookies were the foundation of behavioral targeting, the practice of showing you advertisements based not on who you are in a demographic sense, not on your age or your income or your zip code, but on what you actually do, on your revealed behavior, on the digital trail you leave behind you as you move through the online world. A trail that is far more honest than anything you would ever say in a survey or a focus group. And then, in the year 2000, a company called Google launched a product called AdWords, and the advertising industry was transformed in a way that no one fully appreciated at the time. Google's insight was elegant in its simplicity. When a person types a query into a search engine, they are expressing an intention, a desire, a need in the very moment that they feel it. A person searching for plumber near me is not a vague demographic target. They are a person who needs a plumber right now, and they are telling you so in their own words. Google created an auction system where advertisers could bid to have their ads displayed alongside specific search queries, paying only when someone actually clicked on their ad. This was pay-per-click advertising, and it was revolutionary for several reasons. First, it was targeted with a precision that previous forms of advertising could not even approach. You were not paying to reach 1 million people in the hope that a few thousand might be interested in your product. You were reaching people at the exact moment they were expressing interest in what you sell. Second, it was measurable. For the first time, an advertiser could trace a direct line from an ad impression to a click, to a website visit to a purchase, calculating the exact return on every dollar spent. And third, it was democratic, at least initially. A small business with a modest budget could compete alongside corporate giants, because the auction system rewarded relevance, not just spending power, and a well-targeted ad from a local shop could outperform a generic ad from a multinational corporation. Google AdWords grew at a staggering pace, generating revenues that made it one of the most profitable businesses in human history, and its success proved something that the advertising industry had long suspected, but never been able to articulate so clearly. The most valuable thing in the new economy was not content, was not products, was not even data in the abstract. It was attention. Specifically, it was targeted attention, the ability to reach a specific person with a specific message at a specific moment when they were most receptive to it. And the corollary of this insight was equally profound and far more unsettling. If attention was the product being sold, then the people whose attention was being sold were not the customers. They were the inventory. They were the raw material. The real customers were the advertisers, and the real product was you, your eyeballs, your clicks, your scrolling thumb, your precious, fragile, increasingly fragmented attention. This realization, which would take years to fully crystallize in the public consciousness, marked a turning point not just in advertising, but in the entire relationship between human beings and technology. The internet had started as a tool that people used. It was becoming an environment that used people, harvesting their attention, their data, their behavioral patterns, and selling these to the highest bidder, all while providing services that felt free, but were in fact paid for in a currency that most people did not even realize they were spending. As the first decade of the 21st century drew toward its close, the pieces were falling into place for a transformation even more dramatic than the one that had already occurred. Somewhere in Cupertino, California, Steve Jobs was preparing to introduce a device that would place the internet, and with it the entire apparatus of behavioral advertising, into the palm of every person's hand, accessible every waking moment, a constant companion that would know where you were, who you talked to, what you searched for, and how you felt, and that would deliver advertisements tailored to your individual psychology with a precision that Edward Bernays and John B., Watson and Rosser Reeves and every other advertising pioneer could never have imagined in their wildest dreams. Somewhere in a Harvard dorm room, a young man named Mark Zuckerberg had already built a platform where people would voluntarily share their most intimate thoughts, their relationships, their fears, their desires, their political beliefs, and their daily routines, creating a database of human psychology so vast and so detailed that it would make every focus group and every survey and every consumer study ever conducted seem like drawing pictures in the sand. The age of social media advertising, the age of algorithmic persuasion, the age of the attention economy in its full and terrifying maturity was about to begin. But that is a story for another time, another night, another slow descent into the warm darkness of understanding. For now, let the knowledge you have gathered tonight settle into you like sediment, drifting to the bottom of a still pond. Let it find its place among the other things you know about the world, about yourself, about the invisible forces that shape your choices every day. And as you drift closer to sleep, carry with you this thought: every price you have ever seen was designed to make you feel something. Every free sample you have ever accepted carried an invisible string. Every advertisement that ever made you feel a twinge of urgency, a fear of missing out, a sense that you needed something you had not known you needed 5 minutes earlier, was the product of 100 years of research into the deepest workings of your mind, research conducted by some of the most brilliant people who have ever lived, people who understood you better than you understand yourself, who mapped the terrain of your unconscious desires with the precision of cartographers charting an undiscovered continent, and who sold that map to anyone willing to pay. Rest now and let the knowledge settle, and know that understanding these forces, seeing them clearly, naming them for what they are, is the first and most important step toward reclaiming the sovereignty of your own mind. And so, we arrive at the present, or something very close to it, the era in which the techniques we have traced across a full century finally converge into a single luminous rectangle that you carry with you everywhere you go, that rests on your nightstand as you sleep, that greets you before your own thoughts do each morning, and that has become, without exaggeration, the most sophisticated advertising delivery system ever conceived by the human mind. The smartphone changed everything, not gradually, not gently, but with the sudden totality of a floodgate lifting. Because when Apple introduced the iPhone in 2007, and the App Store followed a year later, what emerged was not merely a new device, but a new relationship between human attention and commercial intent, a relationship so intimate, so seamless, so woven into the fabric of daily life that most of us have never paused long enough to recognize what it truly represents. Consider the sheer mathematics of it. The average person living in a modern connected society now encounters somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 advertisements every single day. That number is worth sitting with for a moment, letting it settle into your awareness like a stone sinking slowly through deep water, because it means that from the moment you wake to the moment you close your eyes, you are being addressed, solicited, nudged, persuaded, and sold to at a rate that would have been incomprehensible to even the most ambitious advertisers of the 20th century. Edward Bernays, for all his brilliance, operated in a world where a single well-placed newspaper advertisement or a carefully orchestrated public event might reach a few million people over the course of several days. Today, a targeted ad on your phone can reach you specifically, not a demographic, not a market segment, but you, the individual, identified by your habits, your desires, your insecurities, your location at this very moment, and it can do so in the time it takes you to glance at a notification. And that word, notification, deserves its own contemplation, because the push notification is perhaps the purest expression of attention hijacking ever devised. It is a tap on the shoulder from a machine, a small vibration or chime that interrupts whatever you are doing, whatever you're thinking, whatever you are feeling, to redirect your consciousness towards something that someone, somewhere, has decided is more important than your present experience. Every push notification is a tiny act of theft, a pickpocketing of your attention, and the psychological mechanism behind it is devastatingly simple. The notification creates a small spike of curiosity, a microdose of uncertainty. What could it be? Who wants me? What am I missing? And that uncertainty activates the same neural reward pathways that make gambling addictive, the same variable reward schedules that keep a person feeding coins into a slot machine hour after hour. You check your phone not because the notification is important, but because not knowing what it contains is psychologically intolerable. And this is by design. Every element of it, from the red badge that appears on your app icons like a small wound demanding attention to the specific frequency of the vibration pattern, chosen to be just intrusive enough to break through your focus without being so aggressive that you disable it entirely. But the smartphone was only the delivery mechanism. The true revolution, the one that fundamentally altered the relationship between advertising and the human mind, was social media, and no company embodies this transformation more completely than Facebook. When Mark Zuckerberg built Facebook, he created something that had never existed before, a platform where billions of people voluntarily disclose their most intimate psychological data, their relationships, their political beliefs, their fears, their aspirations, their daily moods, their friendship networks, their consumption habits, their physical locations, every, like a confession, every share a revelation, every comment a window into the architecture of their inner lives. And all of this data, this unprecedented map of human psychology, rendered in digital form, was not gathered for the benefit of the people who provided it. It was gathered to be sold, or more precisely to be rented, offered to advertisers who could now target their messages with a granularity that would have seemed like science fiction just a decade earlier. You are not Facebook's customer. You never were. You are Facebook's product, the raw material from which attention is extracted and sold to the highest bidder, and the platform itself, the newsfeed, the interface, the entire social experience, is simply the mechanism by which your attention is harvested, refined, and packaged for commercial consumption. The advertising model that Facebook perfected allows a seller of, say, organic dog treats to target specifically women between the ages of 28 and 35 who live within 15 miles of Portland, Oregon, who have recently adopted a rescue dog, who follow at least 3 animal welfare organizations, who have browsed pet food websites in the past 2 weeks, who identify as politically progressive, and who have a household income above $70,000. This is not a broad demographic. This is a psychological portrait, a profile so precise that the advertisement can be crafted to speak directly to this person's values, her identity, her self-image as a compassionate, health-conscious, ethically minded pet owner. And when she sees this ad in her feed, nestled between a friend's vacation photos and a news article about climate change, it will not feel like an advertisement at all. It will feel like a natural extension of her world, a product that was always meant to find her. And this seamlessness is the point, the culmination of a century of refinement in the art of making commercial persuasion feel like personal discovery. And then there are lookalike audiences, one of the most quietly powerful tools in the modern advertiser's arsenal, a technique in which Facebook's algorithms analyze the characteristics of a company's existing customers and then search the platform's billions of users to find other people who share those same psychological and behavioral patterns. People who have never heard of the product, but who the algorithm has determined are statistically likely to want it. And this is where advertising crosses a threshold that earlier generations of persuaders could not have imagined, because it is no longer simply responding to expressed desire, or even manufacturing desire through emotional association. It is predicting desire, identifying the psychological conditions under which desire is likely to emerge, and positioning the product at precisely the moment and place where that emergence is most probable. This is the attention economy, a term popularized by the legal scholar and writer Tim Wu in his essential book The Attention Merchants, and it describes a world in which human attention, that finite, precious, irreplaceable resource that constitutes the very substance of your conscious life, is treated as a commodity to be extracted, bought, sold, and strip-mined for profit with the same relentless efficiency that industrial capitalism once applied to coal and timber and oil. Your attention is the new natural resource, and like all natural resources under capitalism, it is being depleted far faster than it can be replenished. The mechanisms of this depletion are everywhere, so ubiquitous that they have become invisible like water to a fish. The infinite scroll, that bottomless feed of content that eliminates the natural stopping points which once existed in media consumption. There is no last page, no final channel, no end of the newspaper, just an endless river of stimulation flowing beneath your thumb, and this design is not accidental. It was created by engineers and behavioral psychologists who understood that a defined endpoint gives the user a moment of choice, a chance to decide whether to continue or to stop, and by removing that endpoint they removed the decision itself, replacing conscious choice with the frictionless momentum of habit. Autoplay does the same thing with video, eliminating the moment of decision between one piece of content and the next, so that watching becomes not an active choice but a passive default, a state of consumption that continues until some external force, a dead battery, a ringing doorbell, the slow creep of exhaustion, intervenes to break the spell. And notification badges, those small red circles bearing numbers that appear on your apps, exploit a psychological principle called the Zeigarnik effect, the tendency of the human mind to fixate on incomplete tasks, so that an unread notification feels like an open loop, an unfinished sentence, a question without an answer, and the only way to close the loop and relieve the tension is to open the app, which is of course exactly what the designer intended. All of these features, infinite scroll, autoplay, notification badges, pull to refresh with its deliberately variable delay designed to mimic the uncertainty of a slot machine. All of them were created by people who understood the dopamine loop, the neurological cycle in which anticipation of a reward triggers a release of dopamine that motivates behavior. And the key insight, the one that makes social media so addictive, is that variable rewards, Rewards that come unpredictably rather than consistently generate far more dopamine than predictable ones. This is why you check your phone compulsively, not because every check yields something interesting, but because some checks do, and the uncertainty of which checks will be rewarding and which will be empty is precisely the pattern that keeps you reaching for the device again and again. The same pattern that keeps a gambler pulling the lever of a slot machine. And it is not a coincidence that the designers of these systems studied the psychology of gambling before they built your social media feed. And then there are dark patterns, a term coined by the user experience designer Harry Brignall to describe interface designs that deliberately trick users into doing things they did not intend to do. And these represent perhaps the most cynical application of psychological knowledge in the history of advertising, because they exploit not desire or aspiration or even insecurity, but simple cognitive limitations, the shortcuts and biases that the human brain relies on to navigate a complex world. You have encountered dark patterns hundreds of times, perhaps thousands, often without recognizing them. The confirm shaming button, for instance, that appears when you try to decline a newsletter sign-up or a special offer. The button that does not simply say no thank you, but instead says something like, no thanks, I do not want to save money or I prefer to pay full price. Language specifically designed to make the act of declining feel like an admission of foolishness, exploiting your desire to see yourself as a rational, savvy consumer. Or the hidden unsubscribe button, buried at the bottom of a marketing email in the smallest possible font, in a colour barely distinguishable from the background, surrounded by similar-looking links, so that finding it becomes a game of visual hide-and-seek that many people simply give up on, which is of course the point. Or the pre-checked box, the one that appears during an online checkout already marked with a tick, subscribing you to a mailing list or adding insurance to your purchase or enrolling you in a recurring membership, relying on the psychological principle of default bias, the well-documented tendency of people to accept whatever option is pre-selected, because changing it requires effort and attention, both of which are in short supply when you are trying to complete a transaction as quickly as possible, or fake urgency, the banner that announces only 2 left in stock, or this offer expires in 13 minutes and 27 seconds, complete with a ticking countdown clock, when in reality there are 2,000 units in a warehouse and the offer will be identical tomorrow, exploiting the scarcity principle and loss aversion to create a sense of panic that short-circuits deliberate decision-making, or drip pricing, the practice of advertising a low base price and then gradually adding mandatory fees and surcharges through the checkout process, so that by the time you see the true cost, you have already invested time and psychological energy in the purchase, and the sunk cost fallacy makes you reluctant to abandon it. Each of these techniques exists on a spectrum between persuasion and manipulation, and the question of where exactly the ethical line falls is one that the advertising industry has never been particularly interested in answering, because the only metric that matters is conversion, the percentage of people who do what you want them to do, and dark patterns work. They work devastatingly well, which is why they proliferate despite occasional regulatory pushback and public criticism. Perhaps the most dramatic illustration of how advertising psychology can be weaponized came in 2018, when the world learned about Cambridge Analytica, a political consulting firm that had harvested the personal data of tens of millions of Facebook users without their meaningful consent, and used it to build psychographic profiles, detailed maps of individual psychological characteristics, based on the Big Five personality model: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, and then use those profiles to micro-target political advertisements designed to exploit each voter's specific psychological vulnerabilities. If you scored high on neuroticism, you received ads designed to amplify your fears. If you scored high on conscientiousness, you received ads that emphasized order, tradition, and the threats posed by social change. The advertisements were not merely tailored to your demographics or your stated political preferences. They were tailored to your personality, to the deep structure of your psychological makeup, and they were designed not to inform or even to persuade in the traditional sense, but to trigger emotional responses that would bypass rational deliberation entirely. Cambridge Analytica represented the convergence of two streams that had been flowing toward each other for a century: the advertising industry's ever-deepening understanding of psychological manipulation and the political world's ever-increasing appetite for it. And when they finally merged, the result was a system in which the same techniques that sell you laundry detergent and luxury cars could be used to sell you a political candidate a worldview, a version of reality itself, and this was not an aberration. It was the logical endpoint of a trajectory that began with Edward Bernays and his torches of freedom, the inevitable destination of a journey that started with the insight that you can sell anything, including ideas, including beliefs, including fear, if you understand the psychology of the person you're selling to. Meanwhile, another revolution was quietly reshaping the landscape of advertising, one that operated not through data harvesting or algorithmic targeting, but through something far older and more fundamental, the human need for connection. Influencer marketing exploits a psychological phenomenon called the parasocial relationship, a term coined by the social scientists Donald Horton and Richard Wohl in 1956 to describe the one-sided sense of intimacy that audiences develop with media figures, the feeling that you know someone, that they are your friend, that there is a genuine relationship between you, even though the connection flows in only one direction. Parasocial relationships have always existed, with television hosts, with radio personalities, with movie stars, but social media amplified them to an unprecedented degree, because platforms like Instagram and YouTube create an illusion of intimacy that traditional media never could. When an influencer shares their morning routine, their struggles with anxiety, their grocery haul, their unfiltered thoughts recorded in the front seat of their car in a parking lot, the psychological effect is profoundly different from watching a celebrity in a polished television commercial. It feels real. It feels personal. It feels like a friend sharing a recommendation rather than a stranger selling a product. And this is precisely why influencer marketing is so effective, because it hijacks the trust mechanisms that evolved to help us navigate our social worlds, the instinct to take seriously the recommendations of people we know and like, and redirects that trust toward a commercial transaction disguised as a personal endorsement. The line between content and advertising has become so blurred in the influencer economy that it is often impossible to tell where one ends and the other begins. Native advertising, sponsored content, brand partnerships, affiliate links, product placement woven so seamlessly into a lifestyle narrative that it becomes indistinguishable from authentic self-expression. All of these techniques share a common strategy, which is the erasure of the boundary between the commercial and the personal. The transformation of advertising from something that interrupts your experience into something that is your experience. The Federal Trade Commission has attempted to address this through disclosure requirements, mandating that sponsored content be clearly labelled as such, but the enforcement has been sporadic, the penalties negligible, and the creative workarounds endless. A hashtag buried among dozens of others, a disclosure placed where it is least likely to be read, language so vague that its meaning is unclear, and the fundamental problem remains, which is that even when a viewer knows intellectually that an influencer is being paid to recommend a product, the parasocial bond often overrides that knowledge, because the feeling of trust is more powerful than the fact of sponsorship, and the advertisers know this. They have always known this, that emotion trumps information, that feeling trumps fact, that the heart leads and the mind follows. But there is resistance. There has always been resistance, though in the algorithm age it takes new forms. Ad blockers, those simple browser extensions that strip advertisements from web pages, have been adopted by hundreds of millions of users worldwide, a quiet rebellion against the attention economy that costs the advertising industry billions of dollars annually. Privacy regulations have begun to impose limits on the collection and use of personal data. The European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, enacted in 2018, gave citizens the right to know what data was being collected about them and the right to demand its deletion. And California's Consumer Privacy Act followed shortly after, with similar protections, and while these regulations are imperfect, filled with loopholes and hampered by inadequate enforcement, they represent a recognition, codified in law, that the unrestricted harvesting of human attention and personal data is not merely a business practice, but a question of fundamental rights. Apple's introduction of app tracking transparency in 2021, which required apps to ask users for permission before tracking their activity across other apps and websites, sent shockwaves through the advertising industry, because when given the choice, the vast majority of users chose not to be tracked, a result that surprised only those who had convinced themselves that people enjoyed being surveilled. And perhaps most importantly, there is the slow, patient, unglamorous work of media literacy education, the effort to teach people, especially young people, how to recognize the psychological techniques that are being used on them, how to identify when they are being manipulated, how to pause before the emotional trigger can complete its circuit, how to ask themselves why they suddenly want something they did not want 5 minutes ago, how to distinguish between a genuine need and a manufactured desire. Robert Cialdini himself, the psychologist whose 6 principles of influence became a Bible for marketers and salespeople, has spoken eloquently about the importance of this awareness, and he has been honest about its limitations. Knowing the techniques does not make you immune to them, he has said, because these techniques work on deep psychological mechanisms that operate below the level of conscious awareness, mechanisms that evolved over millions of years and cannot be simply overridden by intellectual understanding. But awareness helps. It helps because it creates a small space between the stimulus and the response, a moment of pause in which you can notice that you're being manipulated and choose, consciously and deliberately, how to respond. And in that small space, that fraction of a second between the trigger and the reaction, lies something that the advertising industry has spent a century trying to eliminate: your freedom. And so here we are at the end of a journey that began more than 100 years ago, in the offices of Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud, the man who understood before almost anyone else that the key to selling products was not to appeal to rational self-interest, but to tap into the deep, unconscious currents of desire and fear and longing that flow beneath the surface of every human mind. From Bernays to the algorithm, from torches of freedom to targeted Facebook ads, from the simple newspaper advertisement to the infinite scroll, from the radio jingle to the push notification, we have traced a single continuous thread, a century-long project to understand, predict, and ultimately control the workings of the human mind in service of commercial interests. And what we find when we step back and look at this project as a whole is something both more disturbing and more poignant than a simple story of corporate manipulation, because the fundamental insight at the heart of all advertising, the truth that makes the whole enterprise possible, is not that human beings are stupid or gullible or weak. It is that human beings have needs, genuine, profound, inescapable needs, needs that are woven into the very structure of what it means to be alive and conscious and social. The need to belong, to be accepted, to be part of something larger than yourself. The need for identity, for a coherent sense of who you are and where you fit in the world. The need for security, for the feeling that you and the people you love are safe and protected and provided for. The need for love, for intimate connection, for the warmth of being truly known and truly accepted by another human being. The need for status, for recognition, for the sense that your existence matters, that you have value, that you are seen. These needs are not manufactured by advertisers. They are not artificial or trivial or something to be ashamed of. They are the deepest truths of human experience, the common inheritance of every person who has ever lived, and they exist in you right now as you listen to these words, as real and as urgent as they have ever been. What advertising does, what it has always done, is not to create these needs but to hijack them, to attach them to products and brands and commercial transactions, to convince you that the ache of loneliness can be soothed by the right brand of coffee shared in a warmly lit kitchen, that the anxiety of inadequacy can be resolved by the right pair of shoes, that the hunger for meaning can be satisfied by the right car driving down the right road toward the right horizon. The manipulation is not in the creation of the need. The manipulation is in the redirection, the channeling of authentic human longing toward objects and experiences that can never truly satisfy it. Because the need for belonging cannot be purchased. The need for identity cannot be branded. The need for love cannot be delivered in a package, no matter how beautifully designed, no matter how cleverly marketed, no matter how precisely targeted to the specific contours of your psychological profile. And this is the quiet tragedy at the heart of the advertising age. Not that we're being sold things we do not need, though we often are, but that we're being sold the promise that things can fill spaces that only human connection, only self-knowledge, only the slow, patient work of living an examined life can ever truly fill. 100 years of ever more sophisticated psychological manipulation, and the fundamental promise remains the same, and it remains the same because the fundamental need remains the same, and it will remain the same for as long as there are human beings who want, who ache, who reach out in the darkness for something they cannot quite name. But here, now, in this moment, something different is happening. The screens are dimming, the notifications are falling silent one by one, like stars winking out at the approach of dawn, though this is not dawn but its opposite, the slow deepening of a welcome darkness, a darkness that is not empty but full of quiet, full of stillness, full of the gentle absence of demand. No one is trying to sell you anything right now. No algorithm is watching your eyes to see where they linger. No data point is being collected about your preferences or your vulnerabilities, or the speed at which your thumb moves across a screen. The endless feed has ended. The infinite scroll has reached its limit, and the limit is here, in this moment, in the simple and extraordinary fact of your own breathing. The soft rhythm of air entering and leaving your body, a rhythm that no advertiser has ever owned, that no brand has ever sponsored, that no notification has ever interrupted, though they have tried. They have tried so hard to colonize every moment of your conscious life, but they cannot reach this. They cannot touch this quiet place where your breath meets the silence and there is nothing to buy and nothing to sell and nothing to want except exactly what is already here. Think of all the advertisements you have seen today, the thousands of messages that washed over you like waves, each one carrying a small cargo of desire, a tiny engineered longing, a whispered suggestion that you're not quite enough, not quite complete, not quite happy, not quite the person you could be if only you had this product, this service, this experience, this thing. Think of how many of those messages you actually remember. Probably none. Probably not a single one, because they are designed not to be remembered but to be felt. To leave behind not a memory but a residue, a faint chemical trace of dissatisfaction, a barely perceptible sense that something is missing, and this residue accumulates over the course of a day, a week, a month, a year, a lifetime, until the feeling of not enough becomes so familiar that you mistake it for a fundamental truth about yourself, rather than what it actually is, which is the cumulative effect of 100 years of psychological engineering designed to make you feel exactly this way. Because a satisfied person, a person who feels complete, a person who wants nothing, is the advertising industry's worst nightmare. A closed door, an empty market, a mind that cannot be reached. But right now, in the quiet of this moment, you can feel that residue beginning to dissolve, like salt in warm water, like fog in morning sun, because in the absence of the constant bombardment, in the silence left behind when the machines stop talking, something natural and ancient begins to reassert itself, a calm that was always there beneath the noise, a sufficiency that was always there beneath the manufactured insufficiency, a wholeness that was always there beneath the carefully engineered sense of lack. You're not a consumer right now. You're not a target demographic. You're not a data point in someone's advertising platform. You're not a pair of eyes to be captured, or a thumb to be engaged, or an attention span to be monetized. You are a person, lying in the dark, breathing, and that is enough. That has always been enough. And in this moment, there is no one in the world who is trying to convince you otherwise. Let that settle into you. Let it spread through your body like warmth, through your chest, your arms, your hands, your legs, the slow, heavy warmth of a mind that is, for once, simply resting, not being stimulated, not being engaged, not being persuaded, not being targeted, not being optimized, not being converted, just resting, the way minds were meant to rest before the attention merchants came, before the algorithms learned your name, before the screens lit up and never went dark. The story we have travelled through together, this long, strange history of how the human mind became the most valuable real estate on Earth, is a story that will continue tomorrow, because the advertisers will not stop, the algorithms will not pause, the notifications will return, the feed will resume its infinite unspooling, and you will once again swim through a sea of messages designed to make you want and want and want. But that is tomorrow. That is the waking world, with all its noise and colour and manufactured urgency. Right now there is only this, only the darkness and the quiet and the steady faithful rhythm of your breathing, in and out like the tide, like the pulse of something much older and much larger than any advertisement, older than radio, older than television, older than the internet, older than language itself, the simple animal fact of being alive, of being a body at rest, of being a mind letting go of everything it has been told to hold, every brand, every slogan, every jingle, every carefully crafted message, all of it dissolving now, all of it fading, like the afterimage of a bright screen in a dark room, fading, fading, until there is nothing left but the darkness itself. And the darkness is not empty. The darkness is full of rest, full of silence, full of the profound and radical peace of a mind that has stopped consuming and has simply begun to be. And this is the only thing that was ever real. Not the advertisements, not the brands, not the algorithms, not the carefully constructed desires, not the engineered dissatisfactions, not the thousands of daily messages telling you who to be and what to want and how to live. None of that was ever real. This is real, this breath, this silence, this moment in which you owe nothing to no one and no one is trying to take anything from you. Let the history of advertising become just another story, told and heard and now complete. A story that has no power in the dark, a story that requires light and noise and attention to survive, and in the absence of those things it simply fades, quietly, gently, the way all things made of light and noise and attention eventually fade, leaving behind only what was always there before the first advertisement was ever written, before the first product was ever sold, before the first mind was ever targeted. And what was always there is this, just this, the quiet, the dark, the breath, the slow unwinding of a consciousness that has been wound tight by a century of manufactured desire, unwinding now, loosening, softening, releasing, until there is nothing left to release, nothing left to let go of, nothing left at all but the simple, ancient, irreducible fact of rest. And in that rest, there is something that no advertisement has ever been able to touch, something that no algorithm has ever been able to reach, something that no amount of psychological sophistication can manipulate or exploit or monetize, and that something is the part of you that was here before the noise, and will be here after the noise has ended, the part of you that does not want, that does not lack, that does not scroll, that does not click, that does not convert, that simply is, and always was, and always will be. You can feel it now, can you not? That stillness beneath the stillness, that quiet beneath the quiet, the deep bedrock of your being that no amount of noise has ever been able to crack, though the noise has been relentless, though the noise has been clever, though the noise has known your name and your age and your fears and your browsing history and the exact shade of blue that makes you most likely to click. None of that matters here. None of that reaches here. Here there is only the weight of your body against whatever surface holds you, the gentle gravity that pulls you downward toward rest, toward sleep, toward the ancient and necessary darkness that the screens have tried so hard to replace with their cold blue light, but never could, never will, because this darkness is yours. It belongs to you in a way that nothing you have ever been sold has ever truly belonged to you. And in this darkness you are free. Free from the feed, free from the scroll, free from the endless wanting, free from the 1,000 daily suggestions that you're not enough and you're sinking now, gently, slowly, the way a leaf sinks through still water, turning as it falls, catching the last faint light before the depths take it, and the depths are warm and the depths are safe and the depths are quiet, and you are resting now, at last, at peace in the quiet dark.